Are these five artists the new icons of the internet age? The juggernauts that have collectively exemplified the way that musicians can now collaborate and produce music in a way that artists from previous decades could never have imagined? A new book by the journalist and author Liam Inscoe-Jones argues as such, but his book is more than just a profile of these five artists. It's a sophisticated and interrogative look at how internet culture has changed and will continue to change the music industry at large. A few weeks ago, I sat down with Liam to discuss his new book, Songs in the Key of MP3. Over the course of our conversation, we spoke about Liam's approach to researching and writing the book, why he landed on these five artists to illustrate his argument, and the increasing redundancy of genre labels to discuss artists working today. I hope you enjoy the conversation and encourage you to check out the book, which is out now. Okay, great. Welcome to the channel, Liam, and thanks for doing this. How are you doing today, mate?
Yeah, I'm doing good, thanks, man. I've been out in the Brighton wilderness a little bit this morning, and it's been incredibly bleak. So it's good to to get inside and chat with you about the book. It's great to be here.
Perfect. Well, thanks for doing this once again, and from the kind of grey of Brighton straight into the kind of into how internet culture is changing music at the moment. So you're here to talk about your new upcoming book, Songs in the Key of MP3, the new icons of the internet age. Right away, Liam, I have to say this was such an enjoyable read. It's superbly well researched and thought provoking. And what you do in this book is you take the reader on this journey of how the internet and internet culture is changing the way that artists can now collaborate, write, produce, and release music. And you do this through the lens of five contemporary artists who we'll come on to in just a moment. But at the very start of the book, you take us back to 1948, to the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, where a man called Peter Goldmark is introducing a new piece of recording technology, the LP. Why was it important for you to start this book with this scene?
I think because such an impetus for the book was about what I felt like was a lack of appreciation, in a time and a culture that moves so quickly and is developing at such a rapid clip, for just what kind of astounding leaps have been made in terms of the way that we interact with music over the course of far less than 100 years. Say 1948. The story of this book begins in around 2013 in terms of the artists themselves. And so, in the space of such a short period of time, you go from that, and that itself being a revolutionary moment, him launching something which allowed people to listen to 22 minutes of music uninterrupted in their living room before we were even thinking about doing discos, before we were even thinking about doing, CDs or anything like that. That really was the inception point for obviously then artists beginning to shape narrative albums and think about songs can interact with each other. And then you have artists like the Beach Boys putting together conceptual albums. If that 22 minutes and that leap in technology made all those changes, then I think we should be having far more conversations about, what it means that by like 2010, you can listen to, firstly, obviously music endlessly, plug in your phone, you've got access to any song essentially that's ever been written, a click of a button. But also, yeah, just essentially that enormous leap. And so if that first leap had all those ramifications, what does that incredible
Yeah.
gap mean for the way that we interact with music, the role that music has in our lives, also the way that music is made, and also the way that we kind of just even conceive of music? Because slightly before the 1948, or rather just after the 1948 section, I go further back and say, before that, music wasn't even something you considered as being recorded at all. It was something that happened right in front of your eyes once, and then you could live it through your memories, and that was it. Then it became something that is recorded and set in stone. So what does it mean for music now? So yeah, that's why I started with that section, to kind of visualize that enormous leap in what, about 75 years?
Absolutely enormous. And like you say, we've now kind of gone from this point where, like you say, you have 22 minutes per side on the LP where you say, and now we have this kind of era where you can access music at any point at any time, to the point where music has it's just become a commodity like any other. And you talk a little bit towards the end of the book about what that means for artists, and artists trying to struggle to kind of make a livelihood because streaming software is so ruthless to artists now trying to make a livelihood these days. So I want to get into the kind of the pros and the cons of internet culture later in our conversation. But first, kind of, you use that kind of prologue as a springboard for these 5 artists. And each of these 5 quite meaty, very densely researched chapters explore each of the careers of these artists. But also within the chapters, you weave in your kind of thoughts about music criticism, and you kind of cite quite famous articles by music journalists, and your own thoughts about those articles, and you talk about how kind of music consumption is changing. So you kind of experimented with form in this book quite a lot, and I was really impressed by the way you managed to do that in a very readable way. I just wondered, just kind of before we get into the meat of the book, when it came to actually approaching writing this, did you always envisage it being the book you intended to write from the outset?
Yeah, so I think firstly, from a broad point of view, talking about kind of a style of a book, because you can approach this in so many different ways. You can approach writing a book like this in so many different ways. I think people have spoken about like French academics, like a sign of brilliant academia is making it completely incomprehensible to the average person. But like I'm from pretty working class background. Most of my
Mm,
family, I was the first person in my family to go to university. So that's never anything I've ever valued. I've always thought that knowledge should be completely accessible. Not only should it
mm,
be accessible, it should be entertaining, compelling. And so that was something that I had in mind from the outset of the book, to not make it has to be dense because these artists are so rich, and the culture that they're part of is so rich, but to kind of mitigate against the denseness wherever possible rather than leaning into it. I think sometimes you can read someone, you can tell they're trying to flex, the depth of their knowledge, and I just think that's completely infuriating as a reader. So, in terms of kind of inspirations for the book, it was influenced so heavily by a book I read a year before I started writing it, which was it's by David Remnick, who's quite a kind of like establishment New Yorker
mm.
kind of guy. I think he did Obama's biography or something. But he
Yeah.
did
Okay.
a biography of Muhammad Ali. And I am, again, working class family. My family were all very into boxing. My granddad had pictures of
Right.
Floyd Mayweather
Right.
on his wall and stuff. Like, so I was very interested in the boxing book. But the way that David wrote it was to really put you in the room with these people.
Mm,
And so it started like a profile of a boxer called Floyd Patterson, who was going up against someone called Sonny Liston, who became like a kind of one of Muhammad Ali's first kind of rivals. But the way he wrote it was like, you were in the bedroom with Floyd Patterson. He was packing his suitcase because he was crippled by anxiety. He was convinced he was going to lose. And I was like, oh, it never really occurred to me that nonfiction could be written in this way, where it's like David
mm,
Remnick was born far after these events took place, but he wrote it in a way to put you in the room. And I was like, okay, what if I tried to do that with music writing, and what if I tried to do that with the artists that I grew
mm,
up on? And so yeah, I was trying to do that wherever possible, while also knowing that I needed to do some more kind of typical cultural commentary about setting the scene of these artists' place in the culture. So if it kind of weaves between different styles, that's because I'm constantly trying to cram in the Muhammad Ali
yeah.
biography style while doing a book about five musicians and their place in culture, and where culture kind of stands at the
Mm.
moment.
Could you talk to me a little bit how you went about researching a book that is as densely packed as this? Was it a case of spending a lot of time on the internet and lots of different niche articles, or was it getting up close and personal, like the kind of Muhammad Ali book you mentioned? So just talk a little bit about that process. Would be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like so many different, so many different approaches kind of weave together. Because you're right, obviously, there's points when I'm talking to Caroline Polachek and Nicholas Jar, and
Mm.
like some of Sophie's close collaborators. I was lucky enough to speak to the director Josh Safdie to talk about his work with Oneohtrix Point Never, on as soundtracks for his films with Benny Safdie. So. So I was fortunate to have that kind of degree of access on one hand, and then on the other hand, there were people who, quite understandably, to be fair, I mean, I was quite self-conscious before I started this. I'm kind of looking like a absolute weirdo, just approaching people, obsessively writing these 150
A
page
devoted
chapters
fan, a
about.
devoted fan, Liam.
Yeah, yeah, fine, thank you. Yeah, I was just like, I don't know, I was self-conscious about that, and obviously. Um, obviously artists kind of have that's a part of being a famous musician is that's something that you have to
Mm.
go through in life. But yeah, there was a weird tension in that I was completely fine when someone I was lucky enough to speak to the teams and the management of all of the artists in the book. Um, and obviously some people were keen to participate, other people everyone was so nice and appreciative, and viewed it in the best possible light, which I was really grateful for. Obviously, some people were just willing to participate and others weren't, and that's completely fine. But it meant weaving together those close conversations with talking about, the lives of people who, I've never met,
Mm.
who I haven't spoken to, which I think is something to be taken, not to make it too deep, but to be taken very seriously, and if you put yourselves in in those people's shoes, you'd want someone to pay the utmost respect to both people's wishes in regards to what they share about their private lives, and also to not just say completely incredulous, untrue things. So to reel it back a bit, in terms of the research, it was just trying to be as absolutely thorough as possible when it came to people I
Mm.
weren't speaking to, and to really lean heavily on things that they themselves had said. And so if I'm talking about, if you're reading my book and I'm saying quite confidently about someone's state of mind, that's because an artist has expressly said that themselves in their own words. And it does mean having a certain amount of kind of critical thinking about what you're reading, because there's a difference between what a journalist is reading about an artist, even when they're interviewing them, versus what the artist themselves is thinking about a particular piece of work or a particular moment in their lives. So for example, to never say that an artist felt self-conscious about something because a journalist had said that they did in an article rather than they
Yes.
themselves had. So being quite thorough with that. The research, to be frank, was definitely longer than the writing. And the writing was also long, but like the research for I'll probably worked on each chapter about 4 months in the initial writing period. And I'd say about 3 months was research, 1 month was writing.
Okay.
And obviously
Okay.
through the research, you're pulling pieces. I assembled like a collage of people's timelines basically, and then their thoughts on that and the particular albums they were making, and then all the production notes about those albums and interviews with collaborators from the same time into
Hmm.
just one single document. And then it's a matter of also thinking about how then that feeds into the narrative that I want to write for each chapter, also making
Hmm.
it coherent for the reader. So by the time that you've kind of done the editing of the notes over the period of a month, it was kind of half written in my head, which is why the
Hmm.
month writing um, took a fairly short amount of time because it was already up there. And then obviously you spend months of editing as well, so it was a very
Yeah.
long process, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because it took forever. But I think that's just kind of the due diligence, I think, and anyone who isn't
Sure.
doing that isn't really doing their job. And it was also part of what I thought was a responsibility of the book. Is like, these people have been written about so much, so many think pieces,
Mm.
every album they release, 50 different reviews of the album. I didn't think it was worth writing
Mm.
anything if I wasn't able to say something new about it, or put it in a new
Mm.
perspective, or frame it in a particular light it had never been framed in. You mentioned
Yes.
the Cupid Deluxe, like talking about
Yeah.
that was written about so much as being like this neo soul R&B album at the time. But when you
Yeah.
come to know Devonte and his interests, you can
Mm.
see the Puccini in it. You can see the Neil Young in it.
Yes. Yes.
and then you can see how in that current moment, in that particular moment, when you were having, those first mixtapes on the weekend, or you had How to Dress Well albums, like it was put into a
Mm.
bracket. The context of his life and his interests don't really merit.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point you raised there. It reminds me of the point you make also um, about FKA Twigs and how,
Hmm.
when she kind of first emerges into the mainstream, I think with her early LPs, she gets kind of bracketed as like an R&B or a soul artist. And I
Hmm.
think either you make the point or she kind of makes the point in one of the interviews that you quote of how, to speak frankly, that has to do with her blackness. And,
Hmm.
there's a tendency of, journalists, and, it can be extremely laudable journalists and publications that may just bracket someone into a particular genre just because of the way they look. And one of the most evocative parts of the book for me is where you talk about the likes of Devonte Hynes and FK Twigs talking about, being an artist off, a BAME background and the way that they are categorized,
Hmm.
um, because of the way they look rather than the music they make. And that leads me on to this kind of, you know, you go on these avenues in your writing that lead some really interesting places that kind of question the kind of history of music criticism in a way. So in the Devonte Hynes chapter, you talk about this artist Julius Eastman,
Hmm.
who, for the benefit of people watching who may not be familiar with Julius Eastman, he's young black gay artist who primarily was involved with classical composition, but he becomes a forgotten artist, despite being prolific and clearly respected in this time. And Devonte is clearly inspired by the likes of Julius Eastman and has put out covers of his music in the past as well. And you talk about the nature of how certain artists have been unfairly bracketed or unfairly forgotten. Like you just use this term forceful forgetting as a forceful forgetting of certain artists because maybe the time they were out, um, you know, they didn't look um, they didn't look how other mainstream artists did. So the
Hmm.
mainstream artists and therefore the kind of the canon of pop music and the way we venerate certain artists over others is often based on kind of hierarchies of demographics. So you have like white and middle class and affluent voices, male voices being put on a pedestal above other artists. Why was it important for you to capture? Why was it important for you to talk about that and this idea of forceful forgetting in your book?
I think some of it was, I mean, firstly, I think it's not just important, but it's just like it is reality. I just think
Mm,
this is, what I write in the book is, how I perceive things have unfolded historically. Someone like Julius Eastman, he was operating at his peak less than 10 years after the end of segregation in America, or the Civil Rights Act in America. So it's yeah, it's just a point of historical fact as far as I'm concerned, and that includes up to people like FKA Twigs being written about as R&B artists when people didn't even know, or as she really eloquently put it, she initially obviously was very veiled about what she looked like and had this incredible artwork around her, even her very first music, and people were talking about her being like an alternative electronic musician, and then she started performing live, and suddenly she was an R&B act. So that was obviously something that she was attuned to herself. So I think all of these are just like points of historical facts, and not only is it important, it would just be completely disingenuous for me to not write
mhm,
about. To be writing a book about overarching parts of culture and not include that. Um, in terms of where the impetus kind of came from to focus on forgetting as kind of a political, or rather the antithesis of that, remembering as a political act. I think
mhm,
that is such a truism, especially obviously when we live in such a time where well, I guess, politicians have always, written their own histories. But now you do see populist politicians actively rewriting history, things that are witnessed
Mm.
that we're witnessing in real time before your very eyes.
Mhm.
And so acknowledging, witnessing, and remembering are all political acts when you're faced with, oppressive forgetting, forced forgetting of history. And that was partly in response to a kind of wave of critical theory which was emerging at the end of the noughties, where people were talking about or arguing for a radical forgetting of the past, and
Mm.
that was to be completely transparent about where those arguments were headed. That was about responding to neoliberalism, to the absolute cultural dominance of neoliberalism, and the
Mm.
idea that culture should be a counter to that. And so, the way the genres had evolved is such a clip over the last second half of the 20th century that had slowed. And I do think that's largely true, had slowed by the start of the 2010s. And that was perceived by some, such as the critic Simon Reynolds, and
Mm.
the brilliant academic Mark Fisher, but it was seen as, we're losing the ability to imagine a different future outside of the realms of neoliberalism, was their argument. That's obviously incredibly troublesome. So forget nostalgia. Simon Reynolds wrote a really influential book called Retromania, which is about, how culture stuck in a perpetual cycle of
Mm.
nostalgia, reiterating the past, only idolizing the musicians we've already idolized for 50 years. So he was saying, radical forgetting, let's break out of that cycle, continue
Mm.
to evolve new genres of music, and then by implication, escape the kind of cultural domination of neoliberalism. And I think there's a lot of validity to those arguments. I'm not someone who really contends against a lot of those, but I think something
Mm.
that, post that, we had things like Black Lives Matter. There was
Yes.
until it's been, obviously violently stamped out by the current American
Mm.
administration. At least even in the establishment, some efforts to compensate for parts of history that were kind of buried.
Mm.
So in that decade, which is the decade I kind of was the end of my adolescence and the start of my adulthood, I think it was really hammered home the importance of not just moving on from the past, because the past was written in a particular way, but that doesn't mean it's
Mhm.
written in that way forever. And part of that is, or a real demonstration of that, is someone like Julius Eastman, who, the first complete recital of his music, or the first complete kind of symphonic recital of his music, was kind of in the 2010s. This is someone who died in the early 90s. And, I tried to include nuance in the book. So he himself was a terrible keeper of his own compositions. There's stories of him using his own sheet music as like lining for his cat litter tray. Like, it's not like he helped in the preservation of his music, but then I
Sure.
think there's valid questions to be asked as, would, if this is a white musician who was working at
Mm.
his level, because he was a brilliant composer and a really influential minimalist, would his legacy being forgotten be allowed to happen? And I don't think it would have. So I think
Yeah.
it was an argument for the importance of, while trying to proceed at a rapid clip towards cultural futures, and Sophie, I think, is evidence of someone who does that. On the other hand, that there's a political power to radical remembering, and forceful remembering, and refusing to move on as well.
It is a political act, I think, radical remembrance, and through music kind of bringing to mind the likes of Julius Eastman, or LGBT artists, or black artists who have been forgotten, just by fact that the cultural kind of context they existed with at the time in the 70s and 80s didn't favor people who looked a certain way. So I think radical remembrance, through music or other forms of art, is a really interesting and salient and poignant point that I picked up from your book, and it really was a kind of thought provoking point that I had throughout the entire book, that engaging with these artists in different ways. And one particular artist that you talk about that in particular is Devonte Hynes,
Hmm.
and the way that you talk about this Simon Reynolds essay, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the points he seems to be saying is that everything is a lot of things are derivative now.
Hmm.
Whereas with Devonte Hynes, the counterpoint to Reynolds' argument you make is that, okay, Devonte Hynes is, he's making interesting music, but often he's using his music as a platform to weave in voices from the likes of, Janet Mock or
Hmm.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, and his music shines a light on the past in a different manner. We've talked about Devonte Hynes. I think that's primarily because I'm most familiar with his work, but also
Yeah.
you spend a lot of time talking about FKA Twigs and um, Oneohtrix Point Never. Um, you talk about Earl Sweatshirt, and in the latter chapter you talk about SOPHIE. Um, I wanted to ask you, because we've talked a little bit about the process of how the likes of Devonte Hynes and FKA Twigs, um, there's a feeling of them kicking against the idea of being othered in their music. They're both artists of BAME backgrounds, and they have that in common. You talk in both those chapters about how, you know, their their ethnicity is kind of central to their music. And then with the likes of SOPHIE, you talk about how in SOPHIE's music, she wants to create this sanctuary for LGBT people, and obviously her trans identity becomes a huge part of who she is as an artist. Do you think there's a common thread in the backstory of all of these five artists that you put under the spotlight in this book? Or do you think that's clutching at straws? Did you, as you would go about writing this book, come across common themes that you thought were very interesting as you were kind of writing about these artists?
I think there are like commonalities. I think these are actually five quite different people, or with
Mm,
quite yeah, idiosyncratic upbringings, family circumstances, class circumstances. So I they do strike me as quite separate figures in that way. I think there are commonalities, obviously, in terms of otherness due to ethnicity, sexuality, gender identity. That's part of growing up as any
mm,
minority group. And
mm,
but then on the flip side, I think there are other things which aren't necessarily related to any kind of identity, such as just they all seem like quite shy people. Devontae talked
mm,
about being
mhm,
bullied a lot as a kid. So did
mhm,
FK Twigs. These are just being introverted people, being in your own world. That's part of being a creative person too. Frankly, I don't know if this was in any way your experience, but also if you're a kid and you're creative, and you're interested in, and obviously creativity a lot is associated with softness or sensitivity.
yes.
You're more liable to be, picked on and othered than someone
Mm,
who's big into football or something like that. So I think just part of their personality is a common trait, um, alongside obviously things like people's ethnicities. I think the strongest commonality I found was just the age that these these five
mm,
began being interested in music, and it always made for
mm,
like a quite an interesting start to their biographies. I think these five musicians really, like, they were starting young. There was Dev going to his sister's piano lessons, like when he was still a toddler because he was crying too much when his mum tried to keep him at home. There was Sophie's dad, who was clearly like just an absolute fanatic of rave music in the 90s, and so would, I was lucky enough to meet Sophie's brother and sister, and they were telling me
right.
about like playing, rave cassettes in the car when they were like incredibly young. Obviously, oh, Tebe's dad was literally a noble, noble, poet laureate of South Africa. So, they're all intensely exposed to music at a young age, and clearly, we
mm,
know the impact that music has on our brain chemistries, alongside just our
mm,
personalities. We see it in every aspect of our lives. That clearly had a big impact. So I think that was the biggest commonality above everything else. You're right; they all experienced being othered in various numbers of ways,
mhm.
and that superseded obviously quite different kind of backgrounds. Also three of the artists are British, two of them are American for one. Um, but yeah, the age stuck out, and then also obviously personality traits such as introversion. Apparently Sophie was in her university house, like just vanished upstairs, just making tracks when
Mm,
she also went to the club, definitely went to the club, but
yeah.
she was also cutting tracks when other people might have been down the student union. So that commitment to music as an art form from a very early age
Mm.
is even more so a presiding commonality, I think.
It's very interesting. And I think another thing that kind of I saw as maybe a partially recurring theme in the book, and you talk about in the context of, like the shyness of some of these characters, there's also a sense that some of these artists, they see themselves as almost facilitators of their albums. Okay, they have their artist name imprinted on the record case, but often it's a collaborative effort. So, you have, I think just commonly you can quote Cupid Deluxe. That's got a whole range of different collaborators on, to the point where Devonte Hynes isn't even singing on some of the tracks. Obviously, he's become probably now prolific now as a producer rather than Blood Orange seems to be kind of, it's been quiet for a little while, and obviously he's ramping up classical composition work, but obviously he's behind the mixing desk on loads of different artists at the minute. And Sophie too. I mean, Sophie was an artist, Liam, I have to say, with this book that, again, I've been kind of peripherally aware of just how important um, she was. And obviously, after she passed, there was this huge outpouring of love and appreciation for Sophie's work. But I hadn't quite realised just how um, mixed in she was with the likes of PC Music. Obviously, Charlie XCX
Hmm.
uh, kind of name drops her on Brat, and it seemed that Sophie again, she had this work that was hers. Her music, her name isn't front and center of this music, and it seems it's the case with FKA Twigs on her mixtape Capri songs as well.
Hmm.
That has a whole range of different voices as well. It's possibly one of the commonalities in these artists that you know, they start off making their own music, but actually they're just interested in working with others as collaborators. Is that perhaps one of the, and obviously with the likes of Earl Sweatshirt, obviously he is starts off with Odd Future, which is this kind of internet collective of artists. Is that fair to say, or is that clutching at straws a little bit?
No, I think that one is absolutely the case. But I also wonder whether that is just something which kind of stood out for me in the process of the book, and something that I had my mind altered on. It's just like the case of pretty much all music that we hear is, even if we know it's heavily collaborative, even if we're looking at a rap album and it has a ton of features, or obviously, more, it shows how much music has changed. Some of the concept of a band hasn't even come up in this conversation so far, but
Yes,
a
yes,
band
yes.
clearly very collaborative.
Mm,
But like, no matter how much you're appreciating that, you're still probably underappreciating just how collaborative this music is. And Nicholas Jar says something which is like, spoiler alert, it was a really powerful kind of quote that he gave in that interview, and so I put it towards the back of the book, talking about, frankly, every single album that you listen to is a result of dozens of people's work, and the most you can read through a list of producers, but the most important person in a piece of work might be someone's romantic partner who's there every night when they're stressing because the music's not coming together,
yes.
or he mentions even the lack of someone. The most important person in making an album might be you missing someone you don't speak to anymore. And that's obviously in the more abstract sense, but also in a more literal sense. Managers, creative directors, all these people have such an impact on the music. So I
Mm,
almost wonder whether it's just literally inevitable. Every single artist in the book, is that true? No, it's not true. I think for Devonte Hynes and Daniel Lopatin, Oneohtrix Point Never, they
Mm,
began, or at least it was consistent early on, that they were making a lot of music on their own. Dev, was talking about being holed up in his room in Nebraska making like entire albums just in his bedroom, or One Tricks But Never he was making. Nah, see, there we go. It's not even true. One Tricks But Never, because he was in his dorm room with his mates. So, yeah, there we go. So from the very inception point, people were working collaboratively, and
mm,
it never really stops. Even I think one of the major things which I got from the book is what you're seeing as these tentpole albums in people's careers are really, for them, just one juncture of an entire creative output. And that includes
yes.
like all of the people they collaborated with, even if it's not explicit. But even more than that, it might be you're looking at 12 songs, and they might have spent 2 years working on 50 songs. And it doesn't mean that they
Mm,
necessarily worked on the songs that you're not hearing that much less. Or
mm,
you have people like Sophie. I talked to Hayden Dunham, who was both a romantic and creative partner of Sophie, around 2013 to 2015. They were
mm,
like making like what they called like elixirs in Hayden's home together in Texas. But that was clearly like, it might sound somewhat trivial because it's not lemonade, but it was clearly as major a part of Sophie's creative life as all of Every Pearl's on Insides, those classic
mm,
albums.
mm,
So really, it's there's not really much you can do about it. You're able to listen to what the artist gives you, but just being cognizant of the fact that you're really looking at like ripples in a pond when it comes to people's creative output and these albums, which I think is why
yes.
you see so many artists kind of bristle when you read like a fraught interview with an artist, and they're being interrogated about an album that they made in 2013 and it's 2024, and they're like, I've made like thousands of songs, and I've written a
Yeah,
book, and
of course.
I've directed a film since then. It's
Yeah,
less important to that. It's obviously very important, but it might be less important to them than you as a listener,
yes.
actually.
I think what one interesting thing, again, going back to the commonalities, and it's kind of what you're talking about there, is at the end of what you were just saying, is that for some of these artists, music is just one of their creative avenues. And there's almost this refusal, this kind of unspoken refusal by some of these artists. I'm thinking the likes of Devonte or FKA Twigs, or Sophie. I was particularly struck by the way that Sophie talks about sound as if you would talk about materials or sculpture. And that has something to do with the background that she trained in sculpture, I think.
Yeah.
And I know with Devonte's obviously scored for film, and Oneohtrix Point Never. I hadn't realised it was him behind the sound of Uncut Gems and
Hmm.
Good Time. And it just seems that a lot of these artists now, and this is maybe what the internet has allowed now, is
Hmm.
for artists to be artists in the true sense of the word, truly multifaceted artists. They're no longer just, I'm Devonte Hynes and I play keyboard, I play synth, and I play with the guitar. I also score music, and I do classical composition. And
Hmm.
you talk in one of the footnotes about him being passionate about dance, and you see aspects of ballet in his music videos. That seems a big part of the artist that you talk about in the book as well. Is that fair to say? That these are not
Yeah.
artists, and that they are not music artists. They are artists that dabble in visuals and film and acting and sculpture and composition. Is that fair to say, Liam?
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, again, that's something that my eyes were open to in the course of both speaking to people speaking to people directly involved in the music, and then also, researching people I didn't get to speak to. Like, it was actually true of pretty much every single one of them, with the exception of Tebe, that music was not their first either interest or passion. Daniel
Mm-hmm.
Lockington said to me directly that his first love was film, and even in that conversation, he could even, I mean, he's a very articulate person, but he found it so, or he found it preferable to articulate ideas through referencing certain films,
Okay.
constantly talking about Twin Peaks, which he obviously was such an enormous fan of, and he said he just kind of like kicked back at night and just like rewatch Twin Peaks. That was his favorite thing to do. There's like, yeah, Dev. I think dance came a little later too. Even more so with Dev, like he wanted to be first and foremost, a footballer and a biographer. And I think what is interesting about a lot of these people, including like beyond the five musicians who are the headline of the book, is that they kind of just because you're the first thing you hear of them is a song, it's not necessarily their first passion, and
Mm,
it's also not necessarily what they envisage for themselves. Often in quite a pragmatic way. Obviously, if you love dance and you love music, and you see both more income and success coming from music, then you're going
mhm,
to make a pragmatic choice and continue to pursue and prioritize music. That's absolutely a truism. And I think, yeah, as to reference the Sophie thing, it also massively influenced the music that you're hearing. I wonder whether FKA Twigs would. She's written some beautiful ballads, but I think she definitely
mm,
has a preference for music that she can move her body to. And I wonder
mm,
whether I'd love to speak to her about whether or not she would find it difficult to write from that there's no that couldn't necessarily be moved to, that was less rhythmic, because dance is such a big part of what she does. And then obviously with Dev, it's even within different types of music, he was involved in classical playing, the piano and cello,
mm,
far before he then joined Test Icicles. Hate that I have to say it out
mhm,
loud. And then Lightspeed Champion, and started Bud Orange, like, and so if you're attuned to that, you can hear the classical influence, and the composition and influence, even in the Lightspeed Champion albums, in some of the interludes, and the
oh yeah,
etudes that he includes on one of the records.
yeah, yeah,
But that's him kind of like sneaking it in. But then you're like, oh, in one of the for Angel's Pulse, I can't remember which song it was. He's there with his cello, and he's even weaving that into the world of Blood Orange,
yeah,
which people perceived
yeah,
as being quite separate to that. So yes, as I
yeah.
say, vast, rich, creative lives that we're kind of seeing the iceberg of, the tip of the iceberg
I
of.
think
Yeah,
it's absolutely, and I think first of all, Dev Hynes is going to be living down test tacticals for the rest of his
I know,
life. I
it's a
think. I
shame.
mean, I
Yeah,
quite like some of their singles, but I think he's turned his back completely on that band now. I
yeah,
think
yeah.
the internet has now completely broken down ideas of genre and kind of stay in your lane than ever before, and that kind of speaks to the fact that a lot of these artists have so many different creative pursuits, but we as music appreciators or music journalists or the press, we
hmm
we still try to attach these labels onto artists that the internet means that in the Rosalia song, let's say, you can have traditional kind of Spanish influences. You can have pop, you can have Mike Dean on the Rosalia track, and then there can be in the
hmm
middle of the Rosalia track, there can be like a 30-second drum break, let's say, for
hmm
example. Or, if I'm a young person today exploring Spotify, I can, in the span of 10 minutes, listen to an English language pop song, a Korean language pop song, a Spanish language pop song, and the likes of those artists are all collaborating with one another in ways that they never did before. And that's because of things like the internet. So
hmm
because of the internet and the internet age we live in, genre and form and categorizing artists in these ways is become pretty much redundant now.
hmm
Is that, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think these terms are. I think they're completely redundant. I think they're kind of, but I don't think they'll go anywhere. I'll say that. I don't think, like, if we're talking about genre labels, for example, you will always need the phrase rock to reference, when JPEG Mafia has what sound like rock guitar as part of a beat that then develops into a D&B drum break. You would still need those labels to reference things. In terms of people being put into a specific category, I do think that's increasingly redundant. It's something that
Mm-hmm.
musicians, for the record, have literally never liked. And you can see, uh, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys or Nina Simone, bristling at
Mhm.
being labelled certain things. Obviously, particularly pertinent to Nina Simone is these things at their worst examples, as we referenced, for things like the R&B phrase, but even, more explicitly during times of explicit segregation as, explicit oppressive labels, as in, this is the box of black music and this is the box of white music, and even if they sound particularly similar, or even in the case of white rock and roll took explicitly from black blues and rock music, it was still seen as two separate boxes. There was blues and R&B in the rhythm and blues sense, and then there was rock music, even though they're often one and the same. Yeah, I think those labels those labels will always persist, almost hopefully in less of a negative sense out of necessity in terms of labeling musicians. I think you do see it far less. You see publications being conscious of not just having one limiting category, and so having multiple genre tags for a project, because frankly it just doesn't fit into any of those. In terms of the phrase avant-garde, I don't really know that any of the artists in this book would even qualify as avant-garde, because again, that's kind of a phrase that's lost its meaning. Same as the word experimental. um
Mhm.
I think a true avant-garde, or someone pushing boundaries in music, will be likely someone that not many people are ever hearing. And where it becomes a point of interest for me is when people do more challenging, dissonant, less common in the pop charts things, and then
Yeah.
they interact with people who are doing things which, even just song structure sense, having a traditional hook chorus will mean it's more likely to reach a wider audience, even if
Yeah.
sonically it's pulling from what was once quite obscure club music in the case of someone like Charlie XCX, or even sort of, Lady Gaga was doing that at the end of the noughties. So yeah, even phrases like experimental and avant-garde have kind of lost their meaning,
Mm.
because something I'm guilty of as well. I'll say something experimental when it's also on like an album that's in the top 50. And I think something that's truly experimental would be something that, the majority of people would enjoy listening to, or perhaps only like music theorists would be appreciating of.
Mm.
So yeah, so it's all just kind of become like this amorphous thing. I think it's quite exciting, really. I think listeners are becoming
Yeah.
attuned. That's part of the aspect of the book. I think listeners operate in a different way. I think
Yeah.
almost people will say it as a point of shame. Like, this is only anecdotally, but if someone says like, I only listen to rock music, it's something they'll say, or rap music, any genre of music is something they'll
Mm.
almost say quietly, because the cultural
Mm.
zeitgeist is with people who are completely eclectic and are able to appreciate
Yes.
wide varieties of music. I think I say in the book
Yeah.
that it used to be that cultural elites would very much advertise their knowledge through pure snobbery, through exclusion,
Mm.
through
Yeah.
saying, rap music isn't real music, or even, further enough
Mm.
back, rock music and blues music and jazz music aren't real music.
Mm.
Whereas now it's like a cultural elite, if we're talking economically, and people with a platform, will advertise their eclectic taste, and the fact that they like, yeah, I love Glenn Bracker's 1981 album, and I also love that new Weekend record. They're both amazing.
Yeah.
And that will be a way to advertise sophistication. But I think that's one extreme kind of end of it. I just think your average listener will reference the 1975 album that went to number one in like
Mm.
2017, and it's like, it wasn't even really a statement about the quality of that album. It's just like, it has
Mm.
tropical house songs, it has traditional kind of Britpop guitars.
Yeah.
It just has, it's amorphous, and it was completely kind of unremarkable to the listening
Yeah.
audience. It was just like, yeah, cool. That
Take it.
that's how you do. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit. We've talked about, how good the internet has been as a facilitator of
hmm
different music and helping the artists we talk about producing more exciting music, or seeking out collaborators that previously they wouldn't have been able to. I'm thinking of like sort of Odd Future, they found themselves, but basically a crew, a like-minded crew to put on music. So the internet has undeniably done brilliant things for music today. But I wonder if there's also some negative aspects of the internet that you talk a little bit about in the book, but I wonder if we can talk about now as well. So one thing she talks about is that, when FKA Twigs first comes out, she has this kind of unknown presence, and therefore, music journalists try and attach genre to her music,
Mhm.
or they try and find out more about her. But eventually, because, like you say, she has to earn a career as a musician, she has to do things like press interviews, and the kind of veneer of um, mystery slips.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, and The Weeknd, of course, when The Weeknd first comes out with those early mixtapes,
Mhm.
you know, part of that selling point of The Weeknd was, who is this artist who's got this, voice like a young Michael Jackson? Who is this guy? And now, maybe it's been unfair, but he's become one of those artists that, people don't talk about in the same way than they did in his early days,
Mhm.
and maybe that's some of the sense of his mystique has gone. Um, do you think the internet has 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 meant that artists can no longer have this kind of, secrecy and element of mystery than they did in yesteryear? Do you think that's fair, or do you think that's a misnomer?
No, I think that's yeah. I mean, this is something that I've kind of tried to do with the book in general. Is taking almost kind of like a pragmatic, realist approach to things, and things that people attach a lot of meaning to, and then in the
Mm,
worst cases, see someone on Twitter or whatever it's called, like whining about, is like the fact that these things have changed. It's not like how it used to be, and it's like so often how it used to be, and to reference again Peter Goldmark and the Invention of the LP you mentioned at the start, things were often just how they used to be through sheer practical realities and cultural circumstances. It was pretty hard not to be mysterious as a musician in the 60s. You would release an album, people's main interaction with the music was what they heard. If you were making absolutely incredible mind-bending music like John Coltrane, or where a lot of those jazz musicians, to be fair, you would obviously like, what am I listening to, especially if you were
mm,
talking about new pioneering steps in particular genres like jazz songwriting. And but you didn't know anything apart from a picture. You could just choose not to have a picture to let some artwork speak for it. It was pretty hard to avoid the mystery. If you knew anything about the artist, it might be because you happened to pick up a copy of a music magazine which had an interview with them, or sort it out. But that was even harder to come by. It's something you had to look for. It was just like mystery was just an inevitability. Things moved a
mm,
lot slower, and it wasn't like someone could usurp. Well, yeah, obviously the biggest stars in the world were people who managed to be visually ubiquitous or culturally ubiquitous through the traditional means of the time. In it's no surprise at all that the biggest musicians of the 80s were ones who managed to conquer the MTV space, and the
mm,
biggest musicians, or let's say like even the biggest rappers who came out in the 90s, were because they managed to conquer how to deliver mixtapes, or how to appeal beyond the traditional black music press, and gain some cachet with white audiences. It's whoever whatever you're doing is the circumstances, or however you're operating is the circumstances that you're born into. And so I think, if you do see someone on the internet talking about how musicians used to be mysterious and now you have to, now we know so much about their lives. It's just like that was an inevitability of the circumstances, and I think now it's kind of the opposite is true. And I think, pragmatically
mm,
speaking, you can be someone who is looking to be a musician because you want to be up on a stage and you want pictures of yourself in the magazine, or you can be someone who is just like purely a lover of the art form and just you're making things so you want people to hear them. I think the reality
mm,
is, unless you're signed to a major label, you can't afford to be mysterious. Like, no one's
mm,
like, you're really fighting for decreasing attention spans.
yeah.
How are you going to break through if you're not visual and visible and completely saturated as wide as you
Mhm,
can get? And that
mhm,
includes, obviously, when we saw Charlie rolling out her Brat campaign, she was literally everywhere for the course of a year.
yes.
And that album wouldn't have been what it became if she wasn't
Mm,
incredibly visible. Obviously,
mhm,
certain artists are able to be mysterious. It was, I think the biggest example at the moment is Kendrick last year was able to completely dominate a cultural conversation, have people saying like, that's it, is, clearly the greatest of all time. But his visual
Mm.
presence was just one tweet after another. He tweeted, Euphoria, the series of diss tracks. Then he tweeted Super Bowl. Then he tweeted his new album. That was it. I think he had an interview with
Mm.
SZA right at the end of the year. He didn't even make a appearance on camera, and yet completely dominated the cultural conversation. But that is, I think, like a lot of things, mystery is just a luxury. It's a luxury commodity now. It's something that can be afforded of
Mm.
people who are already successful musicians. Because Kendrick in
Mm.
2009, you can see him rapping in a school canteen.
Yeah.
But once he's got to a level of like, oh, he is Kendrick Lamar, then you can afford to be mysterious for your rollouts. FKA Twigs, she clearly chose to be very visible in this one, but I think she could have
Mm.
had a mysterious rollout in the way that she did her first EP if she chose to,
Yeah.
because she's already a name, she already has a built-in audience. So yeah, it's kind of like a luxury now, I think, pragmatically. If you're just getting
Mm.
started and you would love to be mysterious, I don't think you can really afford to be, because you're not going to get
Yeah.
to the point when you can be mysterious, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that no, it does make sense. I think that's a really interesting point about there's almost a kind of economic necessity, a practical necessity now for artists to be more visible than perhaps when we talk about the likes of FK Twigs or Devonte Hynes, more visible than they are comfortable being, I think,
Hmm.
given their kind of introverted personalities. And one aspect of that I think that's kind of connected is you talked a little bit about, the attention economy and attention spans are kind of lower than ever. This is just a kind of question to put to you who's an author interested in the internet space. I don't really have a view of this, but
Hmm.
and your book is a kind of it's a kind of um, it's putting the case forward that creativity is alive as it's ever been in music through the lives of these five artists. But one of the things we, as music appreciators, we think about is how the likes of TikTok has impacted music, and
Hmm.
there's this kind of need, as well as this need to be visible more than ever. There's this also need to be off the moment more than ever, and the likes of TikTok, it's encouraging artists to produce songs to go viral in 30 seconds where perhaps maybe 20, 30 years ago there wasn't that same lack of attention span by audiences. So by way of example, I finally got around to listening to this this latest SZA album
Hmm.
that I think came out end of last year. And I'm a big fan of SZA's first record, but I've not listened to much after
Hmm.
SOS. So I put on this record, and I think there's a track like BMF, I think it's called, and I think that's
Hmm.
one of the singles from the record. And it struck me that it seemed like a song that was made to go viral, essentially.
Hmm.
I don't know whether that's the cynic in me. Perhaps I need to listen to that song again. But it seems that artists are incentivized and record labels work in a way to incentivize artists to go viral on the likes of TikTok. So I wonder if the internet has, and, apps and things like that, has it also impacted artists negatively, creatively in some aspects that there's no time for, people aren't willing to give maybe artists or albums the chance to kind of marinate in their brains for a bit. They want instantaneous gratification now,
Hmm.
and that often comes in kind of very short, sharp, viral tracks. Is that fair, or do you think again that's a misnomer?
I think firstly, I think one thing that I can say is concretely true, um, is that idea of albums seeming to come and go and not land with the same impact that they used to.
Mm.
Again, bringing
Yeah.
in some of that kind of pragmatism. I think that's obviously a reality of, you used to have to go to a store and buy an album to listen to
Mm-hmm.
physically hear it, apart from the odd single on a
Mm-hmm.
radio station. So, obviously people wanted to invest their money in something that they thought was going to be a good use of their money. So they might, yeah, that's why an album like Thriller dominated for so long, because if you're just someone who's a casual music fan, you'd be like, well, I'll buy the album, which I've heard a couple of tracks on the radio of. That's quite a pragmatic thing. Whereas now, obviously, it's so easy to listen to albums, and I think that's if it's literally impossible to remove the economic ramifications of that. But if you can just excuse that for a second and just be like, okay, that's amazing as a music listener like ourselves, it's absolutely phenomenal that on each Friday, and also then scattered through the week, you have immediate
Mm,
access to this brand new music
mm,
that it once would have cost, I'm in the UK, so it would have cost £15 to access that music. Now
mhm,
you can have it, I'm listening to it by 7 a.m. Um, but then that also denigrates kind of the work that went into that. And I think in terms of cultural conversations, it is crazy, even anecdotally, to just have something which is just oh my god, the new like Lil Baby album's out next week. People are hyping it up, talking, and then it comes, and it just seems to just go, and it's like, oh yeah, damn, I
yeah,
forgot that came out this year. And it makes it
yeah,
even when you're looking back at the start of the year, you're like, oh, that came out this year, because it seemed like
yeah, yeah,
50 cycles ago,
yeah.
so I think that's definitely a truism. And it's one of the, to go back to an earlier question, one of the reasons I wrote the book in the first place is that I think
Mm,
this music is as worthy as any music that would have been one of those concrete talked about albums, like a Thriller, but then
mm,
also like something like a Can album or a Miles Davis album. Like, it's as worthy of that, but the cultural moment doesn't reward sitting with music in that way. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to write almost quite in ways it's not traditional, but also a quite traditional thing of just like, I'm going to write about particular albums for 20 pages.
mm,
That's quite, the people have been
mhm,
doing that since the 1960s.
mhm,
So
mhm,
but maybe not so much about this music from this generation because of that. In terms of your questions about things like TikTok changing songwriting, I kind of don't know. I think it's hard to also apply the same mentality to times kind of gone by, because like was like Bruce Springsteen trying to go viral when he decided to like have some massive synths, some massive drums on Born in the USA, because he knew that if he kept making Nebraskas, no one was going to buy the next album. So he's like, well, okay, I would love to do a stadium tour. So is that trying to
mm,
go viral by doing something that is of the
mhm,
zeitgeist? I don't really think
mhm,
it's that different to these kind of meme moments that we see on albums. Like, I thought Kendrick's last album was fantastic, but like something like the mustard moment
yeah,
on TV off, like that is clearly intended as something that can clip, and people will
yeah,
be making memes to, making doing dances to. Same as, I think you're right
yeah,
about that Scissor song, but is that any
yeah,
different to other artists having a more commercial single on their album that people can play on radio, and then they're either doing something more avant-garde, to use that meaningless no meaningless phrase, or experimental on other parts of the album. I don't really know that it is that different, and I think people in any particular moment in history love to put down whatever's happening in that moment. So I think people get very excited to talk about the TikTokification of music, and as with all
mm,
things, it has positives and negatives. I think there was quite a
mhm,
sad clip of Steve Lacy on his last tour, and he had that song that went like mega viral on TikTok. But the first half of the song was what people were using in their reels and their TikTok videos. So in the crowd, everyone was absolutely going crazy for that first half of the verse, or the first half of the song. For the second verse, it was almost silent, because people would obviously know the song from that first half. So that's obviously sad. And I think there are like studies done. I think it was either the New York or the New York Times, when they're talking about shortening length of pop songs in particular,
yeah,
and then also the idea that the hooks are shifting from, you used to have really long intros to songs. Like, if you listen to a smash hit pop song from the early 90s, they have these long,
yeah.
like 50-second intros, and whereas now
Often,
people
often
tend
with
to,
like, often it's like the sound of a helicopter for 30
yeah,
seconds
yeah,
opening an
yeah.
album, or no?
Exactly. People would start with anything because you bought the single, so what are you going to do? Not listen to it. Whereas now it's like you've got to go instantly with the hook, and so that's slightly changed songwriting. I don't even really view that as I don't really have that much of a preference between, if it's good, it's good. I don't really mind that. I think
Mm,
I think I would lean and it's not a black and white thing, but if I was leaning on more one side, I'd say it's people being a bit hysterical about the current moment and concerns that it's denigrating songwriting. Because again, all the music in this book, week in, week out, people like Nubia Garcia would make like an amazing jazz record, and I'm just like, I don't see that being influenced by the current moment. She headed in quite a typical way into a studio with a bunch of musicians to improvise, to lay down songs that had previously been written, and make a great album that is intended to be listened to front to back in the way that people have done
Hmm.
since the late 1950s. And I don't necessarily, if that was suddenly gone, but I don't see it gone in any way, shape, or form. There's like 50 albums like that come out every week. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think the impact is slightly overstated, I have to say.
Interesting. I mean, it's reassuring as I don't know if you've seen any of the stuff that I do on this channel, but it's all as you've done in the book. It's kind of dissecting albums and kind of really getting under the skin of albums from different eras and different genres. So I'm reassured, Liam, when you tell me that the album still has a place in music, and despite playlists and despite social media
Yeah.
and things like that, there is still the patience of many music listeners to kind of take in and appreciate and let classic cohesive albums wash over them. So that's
Hmm.
really reassuring to hear. I I really learned such a great deal from this book, and it really made me think about how the internet is, like I say, breaking down genres in different ways and allowing collaborators to collaborate in ways like they've never done before, and how interrelated the mainstream is now with artists who previously might have been on the fringe, let's say, in decades past. I wonder what's the main thing you hope readers take away from this book?
I would like, firstly, for people, my absolute favorite thing, and I hope it continues, is when you say, you either hadn't checked out musicians, or
Mm,
you've checked out musicians that previously, especially if the reason you haven't engaged with someone as much is that you think it's kind of like too highbrow or too academic. Because interestingly, with Daniel Lopatin, Oneohtrix Point Never, he was on the few to say to me explicitly, like, he has no interest in making music that's difficult or hard to be appreciated. He didn't necessarily view himself as that distinct from his collaborator The Weeknd, which I can understand that being baffling to some people who listen to the music. But again, like, that's to maybe look at it through the lens of, okay, maybe this is a more impressionistic um approach to doing something I'm already familiar with. I think that's a lens that if someone could then appreciate an album, one of the artists more from this book, because they've had been given a different lens to look at something through, I think that'd be fantastic. I think in terms of lenses and framing, I would love, and this is something that obviously I'm not saying that I'm above. I'm very much part of the same culture as everyone else, but like the idea that you approach certain types of music with different lenses and different framings that are embedded in kind of cultural discourse around those things. Like I mentioned in the Earl Sweatshirt chapter, I do sincerely think if like someone like Billy Woods as a lyricist, if he was writing maybe in folk singer-songwriter music, he would be absolutely, talked all the while about like, wow, real lyricism isn't dead. We've got a Bob Dylan film out right now. Then we've got Billy Woods' incredible evocative imagery. But because he's a rapper, I don't think anyone who's aware of Billy Woods would denigrate his talent as a lyricist, but he doesn't
mm,
enter those kind of conversations,
mm,
because being a talented rap lyricist is still different from being a talented singer-songwriter lyricist, except it's not. So I think, and also just to think as things as being like, well, this is particularly avant-garde or this is particularly pop, to think like Devonte Hynes said, he's the musician he's worked with who's the most knowledgeable about the intricacies of music and the history of music and niche artists, everything like that, was Mariah Carey. You know,
yeah, I saw
these
that.
preconceptions that people come
Mm,
attached to music with time and time again, like, fail under even the closest scrutiny, and yet some of these stereotypes just really persist. And so I think, yeah, if people could approach music that they'd either previously dismissed or even just not conceived as being in the same bracket as something else. I think, really you're talking about people making sounds through instruments and voices, and that's what music
Yes.
is. And I think, practically you need different brackets to being able to articulate things, but to
Mm,
limit things, I think when it becomes problematic. So if people could, and I try to again debunk those time and time again through the book.
mm.
So it would be great if people can move past some persisting stereotypes in music, especially now we're seeing the music itself reflecting those barriers kind of breaking down. I think that would be amazing as well.
It was just so exciting to read a book that feels like it was, the caliber of a music book that could have been written about, a figure that's finished their career. But these are artists that are
Yeah.
extremely contemporary. They're very much part of the nowness. And, like I say, it was only last year, the end of last year, I went to see Vampire Weekend, and then you're
Mm.
mentioning them in the epilogue of this book. So it feels extremely exciting as well to read about extremely contemporary artists. So you've really crafted a really wonderful book. So it's Songs in the Key of MP3, The New Icons of the Internet Age by Liam Inscoe-Jones. Liam, can you just tell people when the book is out and where to find it?
Yeah, so the book is out on April the 3rd. If you're in the UK, you can go to any kind of major bookshop, Waterstones, everything like that. But I'd love you to support um, independent record shops. If you buy from an independent record shop, there'll be a little bonus zine that I've written to kind of incentivize that. So yeah, that's the absolute lifeblood both of publishing and of the music industry. So if the UK, that's where you can find it. If you're outside of the UK, then the ebook will be out on the exact same date, so you can buy it that way, and will be published in countries closer to you at a later date.